In what ways does your media product use, develop or challenge forms and conventions of real media products? My magazine used, challenges and develops many media conventions that I have seen in magazines that I have analysed. These are 2 Q magazines and an NME magazine. One example of using conventions that I have seen in the magazines I've looked at would be the masthead I chose to use for my magazine. This uses a similar style to Q magazine. Q magazine's masthead is a red square with a white Q in the middle. I used a similar style for my own masthead. This was using the same box idea, but instead of being red, I chose to use a grey square with an R which stands for rhythm. However, I felt that I developed this convention as I wrote rhythm and the R in the same box. I felt this was an improvement than just using an R because it shows what the R stands for and gave it a better look. I also used a similar selling line as that in Q magazine. This was a black skyline with white capital serif font inside. Both Q magazines used this and I felt it was a widely used convention. In one of the Q magazines I analysed, I saw the names of artists in small white boxes on the side of the page. These were the smaller stories within the magazine and I liked the way this looked and was done. And so I used this convention but developed it by making my boxes and the text within them different colours to go with my house style and made them go all the way to the edge of the page. One convention that I used that I noticed on the front cover of one of the Q magazines was making the more important stories in larger fonts at the top of the page. This made them more noticeable and drew more attention to them. I liked this idea and it was also useful to make the cover lines in the same colours as my house style. Having larger fonts to show off the better cover lines is a widely used convention that I saw in both of the Q magazines and the NME magazines. I liked the way this was done, however, because the way it was set out was almost like a list. One thing I disagree with, however, was that in the Q magazine there were too many stories in this one compact space, so I only put 3 stories and made them much larger. I took one convention seen in NME magazine and changed it to fit the needs of my magazine. This was the box around the main cover line. I liked this and used it but changed it. Instead of having one big box, I put an individual box around each word. I felt the way that NME used this convention created empty space with my cover line. I also felt that this gave my magazine more of an indie feel, which is important because although my magazine is a general interest, the main cover line's story was in the genre of indie, which means that the rest of the magazine should follow this style. One problem that I found that in a well-known magazine this would be okay, but my magazine could get the wrong impression and be seen as an indie magazine rather than a general interest magazine. I also challenged one convention seen in NME because the writing on the main cover line was in big, bold letters. I changed this by doing my main cover line in a simple serif font, but I made it large and bold and red so it would stand out. I feel this gives my magazine individuality. My contents page used a convention that I noticed in Q. This was using a cover line, divider and then text to divide their contents. I developed this by using a divider, then a large font for the cover line, then in smaller text put more detailed information about this story. I personally preferred the way that I have divided my context, but got the inspiration from this from my analysis of Q magazine. I used the convention seen throughout Q magazine of having a small masthead in the banner at the bottom of the page with the page number, the web address and the issue. I liked this convention but felt that it did not look right when I tried to do it in my magazine, so I used a similar idea but developed this by having a masthead instead of a page number on the contents page, but on the rest of the pages having no masthead and a page number instead. I did this as I felt it looked too busy with both the masthead and the page number. I also used a convention that I saw in both Q and NME magazine in my double page spread. I've used an image to dominate one page of my double page spread and text to dominate another. This makes it seem less text heavy and more easy to read. It's also a nice layout for my magazine and makes it look nice. I've challenged the conventions, again, of both Q, NME and most of the magazines, as I've had images of the person who was in my double page spread in both studio-like shots and images that were throughout the week in her interview. In Q and NME, there is either one or another and not both. I feel this is a good way to set images, and I feel I have challenged the conventions of most magazines. How does your media product represent particular social groups? I feel my magazine represents social groups in a way in which it creates countertypes. For example, on my front cover there is an image of an indie girl with blonde hair. This, for one, is a countertype, as typically when thinking of indie genre, a male group comes to mind. Also, when thinking of indie girls, orange or pink hair comes to mind. However, the girl on my front cover is dressed in an indie way with backcomb messy hair and dark eye makeup, which gives her more of an indie feel. She's also young, which goes against stereotypes of someone you would typically see on the front cover of a music magazine. The shot of her is a studio shot, but she is wearing ripped clothes and had messy hair, so these two things oppose each other, as a studio shot should be more upper class looking, but she has gone for a very lower class look. This is also a countertype to what you would expect. Also, in another image of the drummer from the band The Dandelions, the man in it is smiling and posing, but it is not a studio image. When I was looking at NME magazine, I found that none of the indie bands would smile in images, but rather pull a straight, serious face, whereas this image, he is going against the stereotype and smiling. What kind of media institution might distribute your media product and why? I think that my magazine might be distributed by an institution such as Bauer Media Group, as they distribute magazines much like this. One example of this is one of the magazines that I analysed, which is Q Magazine. I analysed 2 Q magazines and got much of my inspiration from Q. This is a monthly general interest magazine, and like my magazine, it targets many audiences but focuses slightly more on indie than other genres, so I think this institution or others like it may be interested in publishing my magazine. However, a company such as IPC Media may not be interested in my magazine because despite the indie feel to my magazine, the magazines that IPC Media distribute are more indie magazines and they are weekly, so they are different to the feel that I'm trying to get for my magazine. One magazine that I have analysed that IPC Media is NME magazine. Who would be the audience for your media product? My target audience for my magazine will be males and females between the ages of 16 and 30. From my research, I have found that there will be more males. Also, my target audience will be more upper working class and middle class, as the price of the magazine will be £3.20 and so they would need disposable income. This is a good price for a monthly magazine, but still quite a lot to pay. As this is a general interest magazine, it will appeal to a wide range of people as there is a range of genres. This means that it will also appeal to a wide range of ethnicities, as typically certain genres are preferred by certain ethnicities. For example, R&B is more preferred by Asian boys and girls, whereas hip-hop is more preferred by African Caribbean people. Also, part of my audience would be casual readers, because the person on the front cover of my magazine is an established star, and therefore fans of her would buy the magazine just to read the article on her. How did you attract or address your audience? I'm going to attract my audience by using direct to address. This is when the person on the image of the front cover is looking at the camera, which gives the effect of them looking at you when you look at the magazine. I also attracted my audience to my magazine by putting the masthead at the top of the page and making it eye-catching, as this will draw people to it. I used an established star in the front cover of my magazine, which would attract people that like the artist and casual readers. Another technique I used to attract my target audience was the cover lines and stories in the magazine. I try to get up-to-date and interesting stories which create enigma, so the audience wants to read on. As they are young, up-to-date things will be more attracted to them. For example, one of them was V-Fest lineup. This is an exclusive information which readers would want to know. This again may attract casual readers. One way in which I addressed my audience was that the language I used. As this is a general interest magazine, there are many genres, so it's mostly formal. However, my double page spread was on indie artists, and therefore it used more colloquial language, even down to using swear words, for example, who gives a shit. Also, there is some light humour throughout the magazine which also addressed my audience. This occurs through the interview and some through the contents page. For example, on the contents page there are puns in the detail under the cover lines. What have you learned about technologies from the process of constructing this product? I have found that while doing this work, the technologies available are useful, however some of them have their downfalls. One of these is using a WordPress blog. This is a good site to use and store work on, and it is cloud-based storage, which means it can be accessed anywhere where there is internet available. However, this was a risk as it is on the net, so if you cannot get to the net in class or at home, then you cannot access your work or store any new work you may have completed. Also, if the website itself crashed, your work could be deleted, so I found it was useful to have a digital backup just in case. While doing this work, I also learnt to use Photoshop. At first I found it challenging as I had to learn how to use all of the different tools. Examples of tools that I used in my magazine were layers, as everything I did on Photoshop had to use a new layer. Also, I used text boxes for all of my writing text and drop caps. I found the marquee tool very useful, and it was one of the tools that I used more than most of the others, as my magazine has a lot of boxes around text. Another tool I felt was useful was the duplicate layer tool, as some of the things on my magazine were identical. For example, the boxes I put my page numbers in. I found it was much easier to duplicate the layer than make a new shape and try to get them to be exactly the same. I used transforming to get my images to fit into the spaces I needed without distorting them. I also learnt how to use Apple Macs, which once I knew my way around them made it much easier to do this sort of work. And found when I was doing work at home on Photoshop, it was harder to use than when I was at college on the Macs on Photoshop. Looking back at your preliminary task, what do you feel you have learnt in the progression from it to the full product? When comparing the preliminary task of the college magazine to the music magazine I've created, I can see a huge difference in the way my skills have changed. One of the first things that stand out to me is my preliminary task. My understanding of house style was clearly not as strong as it is on my music magazine, as there seems to be lots of different colours and fonts, and it's hard to see any house style when looking at it. I feel that through doing the preliminary task, I understand how important consistency was when designing a magazine. However, in my music magazine there is clearly a house style of black, grey and red, and it runs through every page. Another convention that was clearly improved when comparing the two was my masthead. In the Beach mag, my masthead was bubbly blue font with an orange line around it. It didn't go with anything in the magazine and did not look like a masthead. However, in my music magazine, my masthead fitted in with the more middle class formal tone I've tried to set. I got my inspiration from this from Q. I also think my positioning of things is much better and more in line. Looking back at my preliminary task, I can see things aren't as straight, and the baseline is slightly off, and in my music magazine it's slightly more together and in line. Some of the smaller things that I have noticed I've improved on are things like dead space. In my college magazine it is less noticeable because of the busy background, but if I use the same positioning on my real magazine as I used on my college magazine, I would have had lots of dead space on my front cover. Also, in my college magazine, none of my images had captions, but in my music magazine I have used captions that gives the reader more understanding of the images and where they were taken. One thing that I feel I've consistently had no problems with is my gutters and columns, as they seem to be reasonably consistent on both my preliminary task and my music magazine.